But you know how it is. They'll come at you 10 directions trying to take you down, and I certainly had my threats.
In this episode, I'll be sitting down with Dr. Christian Bogner, board certified in obstetrics and gynecology and the founder of Bogner Health in Michigan. 17 years ago, his life took a dramatic turn when his son was diagnosed with autism. As a physician, he quickly realised that conventional medicine didn't hold the answers he was looking for. So he went deeper into genetics, biochemistry, the gut microbiome, and the hidden impact of environmental toxins.
Improvement, I would say, probably in the 80+% range.
As much as that, really?
It was the crazy, and I was in practice already for 5 years, and I've done so many things. Nothing came even close to the results that we saw in such a quick manner.
I'm taking a moment to process, really, because you've got two things going on there. This conversation goes beyond medicine. It's about a father's mission, a doctor's evolution, and a new way of seeing the human body. One that could change everything we thought we knew about healing.
To stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Hi, Christian. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Gary. Pleasure to be on.
As you know, I've been doing quite a bit of work with the mums and, the people involved with the telepathy tapes. I've interviewed Diane now and Jeff Tarrant, and you came up early on. I saw that you were doing stuff with the microbiome, which coincidentally, for my own health reasons, there's been such a flurry of microbiome awareness and gut health, with the Zoe project and various other things. I wanted to speak to you, generally on that anyway, but as it's more specifically connected to what's going on with these special children and special adults that are displaying these abilities, I thought it was even more powerful to talk to you on what you know. But I thought I'd sort of ease into it. I've prepared some questions, which I usually sort of do. I brainstorm myself of what I want to go through. And I've watched a few podcasts that you've done. You've often said that your son was your greatest teacher. Can you take us back to the beginning of your journey and how it transformed your practice?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So Phil is my son. He's my first. I have 4 kids. Uh-huh. He's 20 now, and he's developing fine until about 1.5 years of age. He received the MMR and boom, had a regression. Over the next several weeks, stopped responding to his name, repetitive movements, tantrums, lost his words that he had acquired until that point. And, I was a physician, just in residency at that point. I was an OBGYN. I worked for 12 years, and I didn't find any help from my physicians, my pediatrician. They just said, okay, well, that's autism. And, there's no relation to vaccines. You're crazy. There must have been a coincidence. Let's do ABA, let's do speech therapy and OT. And, that's still until today, that's what the pediatricians recommend. And that didn't help at all. Went to expensive, 3-month intensive intervention programs, everything. And so I took things into my own hands. I'm like, this is, it's definitely related to the vaccine because he was developing fine until that point. So I want to, reverse that process. It can't be that hard. Well, it's not easy. But over the years, I couldn't stop researching and eventually left. I had a very good position. I was working in a hospital, doing surgeries, at this point already 8 years in practice after residency of 4 years, and got my functional medicine certificate because all I researched was autism, how to help my own child. And then eventually, with my functional medicine certificate, I started to counsel families of what I've learned, spoke on conferences and just trying to provide guidance and advice, interpreting results, ordering tests, and trying to improve the lives of these children. And, now 7 years later, I think reached a point where we're finally seeing results. It took many years of trial and error, ordering a lot of tests, talking to thousands of families to see what has worked for them. I've seen probably everything under the sun of what parents have been using, not because I recommended it, but just by listening. So I learned the most from talking to families. There's all types of different types of autism. But yeah, that's kind of the nutshell espresso version of how I got into this. But my heart is with these families because I'm a parent myself.
Sure. And how soon after the vaccine did the symptoms start to, come up?
Weeks gradually. Yeah, it wasn't many times I talked to parents and I say, oh my God, the same day he had a seizure, we had to go to ER, and they said, oh, it's a coincidence. For him, it took several weeks to gradually get worse and worse, and then he got stuck there.
It's. I mean, obviously, since COVID, it's become such a. I watched some hearings today, actually, that are going on in the American Senate about the vaccine and how blood clots have occurred and how they were detected and they weren't reported about because they were sort of encouraged to look somewhere else. And there were so many people that were saying these things, or at least start trying to ask questions about this stuff, and the tactics with how they were being shut down and it's coming out now. We got one brave politician in this country, a guy called Andrew Bridgen, who actually stopped children getting vaccinated, 2-year-olds being vaccinated with boosters for the COVID. He actually, got the government to stop doing it, but they did so without an admission that their own figures were showing that there was no need to take the risk to vaccinate people that young and so on. And he's been ostracized. He's not in Parliament anymore. And, that controversy around this whole subject still continues. I mean, I'm even hesitant to use that word because it sort of, people know that it affects the algorithm of how YouTube will see if you're saying something controversial and so on. But this whole subject about vaccine, and I heard something recently about as soon as a child is born, we're sort of straight in there with some vaccinations, aren't we? I think there's a K2, is it a vitamin K jab? And then there's something else that they're giving.
Hep B, it's usually hepatitis B and vitamin K, which does contain aluminum.
Yeah, but I mean, giving a child straight away Hep B, what's the kind of thinking behind that straight away as soon as they're kind of born?
Well, I worked as an OBGYN for 12 years, and when I see a pregnant woman in the beginning, you have the standard set of labs that you have to get, right? And part of that panel is a hepatitis B antibody test to make sure that the patient is immune against hepatitis B. And if they're immune against hepatitis B, despite exposure, they shouldn't get hepatitis B, and the risk to the fetus or the newborn, fetus in this case during pregnancy, would be literally not there, right?
Yeah.
And we also repeat those labs in the 3rd trimester, just to make sure that in the meantime, nothing happened. But so basically, most children that are born are hepatitis B negative. So there's not like any reason to really give that vaccine. The problem was that in the 80s, there was a lot of hepatitis B on the rise in this country, and they had just really trouble with people to contain the hepatitis B prevalence. And so they just said, let's just vaccinate everyone at birth. So there's no hesitancy later because, it's mostly transmitted through IV drugs, injections, and sexual. Those are the major transmissible rates. So you don't have this population necessarily complying with that. So they would never be able to contain it. So the idea was, let's just give it right at birth. Entire population, no excuses. That is really the best reasoning that I could find. I talked to many neonatologists and pediatricians about this while I was still in practice and delivering babies, because I saw it right now. Delivery, getting ready for delivery, Hep B is right there on the table. Boom, do it in the first 24 hours. And I never really got a good answer, even from the neonatologists. They're like, well, hepatitis B, you don't want the kid to get hepatitis B because if they do, they get liver cancer. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're telling me that you have a suspicion that this newborn baby is going to engage in sexual activity or share needles with the other babies or something like that, because how else would you get the hepatitis B? Plus, there's passive immunity from the mother's breast milk, and the antibodies offer protection. So at least do it later. Why at birth? And so anyway, that's my answer to that. It's completely unnecessary vaccine.
Just intuitively from a non-medic, it seems like giving a microdose of Hep B to a newborn just doesn't seem right for a non-medical person. So if a medical person says, well, like yourself, an OBGYN says, why are we doing this? What is the reasoning behind it? And the reasoning that comes back to you is nonsensical.
Absolutely nonsensical. I haven't found a good reason. It's not transmitted by sitting on the wrong toilet. So it is sexual. It is IV use.
Wow.
Yeah. So that makes you question, is there a bigger agenda behind it? I don't want to speculate.
Were they like the first cracks? So that was I'm right in thinking that's like the first cracks that you found in this approach to.
The second, maybe, because then they have the flu vaccine and the DTaP during pregnancy, which, I started to, in my practice, during my counseling for the pregnant patients that I have seen, discourage vaccinations, even during flu season. I discourage prenatal vitamins. That's another one, big problem. And then, of course, Hep B, and I always told the moms, stay strong, be informed, know what you're doing, watch your child like a hawk. If they take him to the nursery, they might vaccinate without your consent. So, and it wasn't easy, because I had to be careful because I was board certified, and that was definitely against the recommendations of my medical board. But you know what? At that point, I didn't care. I'm like, you know what? If they want to get me for that and take my certification, I don't want to be an OBGYN because I'm not, following orders from something that I don't believe in. It's between the patient and the physician usually. But you know how it is. They'll come at you 10 directions trying to take you down. And I certainly had my threats over the years. But eventually I left that and just took care of the children.
And that's it, isn't it? They're relying on the fact that 9 out of 10 people, their morals and their ethics are not going to cut their nose off to spite their face. They've normally got mortgage, and they've got kids in school, and they've got responsibilities, and they have to keep their job, and so they know it's wrong, and they have to do it anyway because society and the culture that we live in sort of. I had I worked in a job recently where there were some things going on, and essentially it's dishonest, right? There was some dishonesty going on. And when I left, I resigned, and I said, look, they wanted to have a meeting, the HR department wanted to have a meeting as to why I left. I laid out all the, I gave a couple of examples. There were many more examples, but I laid out what my principal objection to what's going on was. And there was a kind of strange, I suppose it's strange. There was this that they felt it was strange that I was being naive, that of course everybody knows that what we say to the public, what image we present is nonsense, and what we do behind the scenes is fake. We fake it, we bullshit, we ignore, we dismiss, we willfully blind ourselves to. What's wrong with you? I felt that. Do you know what I mean? And so that's the kind of pressure that you get put under just from one angle when you're in that kind of position, right?
100%. I mean, that's not just society, it's family, friends, just to come up with the idea that, hey, the vaccines made Philip regress.
Yeah.
Back then, it was my own wife. So
yeah,
she was a physician and we had different opinions, didn't work out. So
yeah,
that's the thorn in my soul. But
yeah,
it's not just society. And at this point, I've accepted it because kind of found your tribe. Small espresso version of good people. And that's all I need. So I don't need any recognition. I want to help one child at a time. I don't care if I'm the biggest a-hole or if they want to call me a quack or fraud. I've heard it all. I have websites that say, it's not based on science, and taking advantage of parents. I'm like, well, please take a look at the hundreds of testimonials and emails and messages that we share openly, open source, and you find something better, please, by all means. But please don't forget one thing, that this is a medical condition. It's not a new human that we need to cherish and that they're special. No, that's what they want you to believe. The neurodiversity, autism pride bullshit, if I want to say it like that. We don't believe in it at all. It is a medical condition, and we can treat that, and we can improve symptoms and improve quality of life.
So this neurodiversity thing is a strange one, isn't it? Because there is a kind of, in the UFO community, which I'm not a part of, I'm vicariously kind of connected to it. I worked for a journalist in Mexico City for a number of years as a correspondent who sort of specializes in that. And I used to do my crop circle reports, fly over, take photographs of crop circles, interview farmers, interview people.
Beautiful. They're beautiful.
That's why I love them, right? Because they inspire awe and wonder. And I think that's missing from humanity. I think we live too materially and too horizontally, and we don't have that vertical aspect to our lives anymore, which is what you just said, a sense of belonging to something, having a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. And some of that is having a sense of awe and wonder. Some people get that through, or people used to get it through, religion, but institutionalized religion and its rules, and asking people to wake up and adhere to 10 rules that they don't even understand why they're doing them before, is driving people away. And they're looking for a sense of connection, I think, in lots of ways. And so awe and wonder is why I love the crop circles, because you see people open up to something they don't know. In the paranormal in general, when you talk to people about people who've had a UFO experience, people who've had an abduction experience, people who say they've had, these things, you don't have to, you see how society responds to them with kind of knee-jerk responses of like, you were hallucinating, or it's just, what drugs were you on, or those kinds of things. And that tells you something about the society we live in, that they don't listen to their husbands, wives, friends and neighbours and people they've known for years when they say something strange has happened to them. And then you invariably see these people go on a journey. And it's the same with these telepathy tapes. It's the same with these strange abilities, which we can't explain under the current paradigm at the moment. Although, strangely, we can explain them if we bring in a paradigm of quantum physics that we discovered 100 years ago and start to explain how precognition or some of these other strange things we can't explain could be happening. We could have a conversation, a grown-up one, about it, but we can't seem to do that, can we?
Well, again, it will take some time. It's a kind of a leap. First, for somebody to understand, okay, it's a medical condition, and then we can go into, okay, well, some, if not all of these children have precognition and telepathy abilities. Let's discuss why. And I think there are explanations for everything, and I think the reason for these abilities are truly chemical.
There's something curious about the digital age we find ourselves in. We travel vast distances with a single thought, cross boundaries of time and culture with a swipe of a finger, and yet connection, true connection, still comes down to simple gestures, like clicking subscribe. Now, it's blown my mind a little bit, but I've noticed that only 22.8% of you have done that so far. Trust me, I get it. Sometimes we wander into ideas without knowing if we'll stay. But look, if you've made it this far, if the content resonates with you, then I'd like to invite you to be part of this conversation. Subscribing isn't just a button, it's a signal. One that tells the algorithm, and quite possibly the universe, that curiosity still matters. In return, I'll keep seeking out meaningful voices, I'll keep asking the questions that don't always have easy answers, and I'll keep building this space for thoughtful exploration. So come on, do me a favour. Click that subscribe button and let's keep going.
Why accept a narrative? We always want to ask questions. That's what science does. And we shouldn't be vilified for that. And, I think, what you said in regards to the isolation, I think for a parent, myself with autism, it's a very lonely world, or at least so you think, until it's not. Because knowing that there are others, millions of others who living the same life that you do with the struggles with your child, while others go for baseball practice, you stay in your home like a prisoner. Knowing that there are others out there, and especially that there are people working to improve those lives, is the biggest comfort that I could find.
Got you.
Because, you're not alone. You're not isolated. And it's the same with the UFO community. It's freaking amazing. Who could with certainty say that it's not possible? So
and the reason I mentioned that was because the recent kind of like Congress hearings and Dr. Gary Nolan being brought in saying, look, the CIA approached me in 2014 and wanted me to start investigating the brains of people like pilots who've been near these things, these crafts that move at these speeds, and et cetera, right? Gave a Tucker Carlson interview, and you think, wow, all right. Now, his recent interviews and what he's doing with the Soul Foundation, and I'll just bring this up as a side, really, not something I want to dive straight into, but they're talking about neurodivergence as something that's connected to this phenomenon. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, with telepathy tapes, we got early involved when I wasn't really on the radar of most. And Diane Powell, you hear her name. She's the neuropsychiatrist. She got educated at Hopkins and then Harvard, and before she moved to the West Coast. But since the 80s, she was interested in autistic savants, mostly driven by her own experiences in the psychiatric world of meeting patients that have psychic abilities. And she was like, how in the world is this happening? Because everything they're telling me is true, despite her trying to reason against it. But eventually these people that she met were maybe not so crazy after all, because everything they said became reality. But she was talking about it because I was on the phone with her just recently, and she's involved with that actually, with some UFO groups, I believe, because they use them. I think when Greer, I'm sure you know him.
Yeah.
Around Inauguration Day, they had this big announcement that they are releasing some footage for the first time, and it was this X-shaped thing. And apparently the way it got to that point was that they used somebody who called for that phenomena to occur. And those are usually those with, these precognition, or are usually on the spectrum. And she was very much interested in that. But I don't know more details to this, but yeah, why not? From what we have experienced 3 years ago of meeting, when I first came in contact with a child with these abilities, 3 years before the telepathy tapes came out, the information that came through was just life-changing for me.
Right.
And inspired us to actually start a business because of what he told us, because it immediately had such a big impact on the families that we treated. And nobody's even heard about this chemical that he told us about. And apparently it's known to humans for 300 years. And
let's dive into that. Tell me about that, because I've seen you do a podcast with a guy where he's the guy that supplies these top grade herbs, that the most refined, best quality, and
Lindsay.
Yeah, Lindsay, that's it. He seemed to really know his stuff. So is that where we're talking there? Is it connected to that?
That came later,
Okay.
Once we started our own supplements and that molecule that we found. But I got introduced to this family from a nurse friend of mine. She's like, hey, look, their 9-year-old is communicating with typing. He's a nonverbal, severely autistic child. He was so severe that he didn't even qualify for behavioral therapy. They kicked him out. And during COVID, he started to learn how to type on a keyboard very quickly. And the parents were amazed. And he's like transmitting information. It's like, oh my God, he's jumping on a trampoline. He's very hyperactive. He's stimming. Yet when he sits down, he types. And it was like highly intelligent. And nobody believed them. They showed their doctors and they're like, yeah, that's gibberish. We should put him on medications. Actually, that's what he said. We should put him on risperidone. And he's like, this will turn me into a zombie. And so they basically listened to their son more so. They believed so much in what he was transmitting that they actually went against the recommendations of the physicians. And so then I came along and introduced myself. I'm like, hey, I'm Christian. I have my own son. I've been talking to a lot of parents. Maybe I can help you. You can help me. We help each other. And so I showed him, shared him what we kind of had there. No, in fact, he the parents asked him, that's what was shared with me, do you know the cure for autism? And he said, yes, it's STS. And they're like, what's that? Oh, it breaks up SCP or something in the brain. And so there were all these abbreviations, STS and, SOS actually, he said, and then it breaks up some protein in the brain. And they showed their doctor, and they're like, this is gibberish. It's a coincidence that these letters came together, and all of that's impossible because of his behavior and the severity. And so then before I met with him, I did my research. And hear me out, because I think this is going to be interesting for your audience, because grains, right?
Sure.
So I looked at, what is this SOS? What could this be? And I came across this paper where in the farming industry, right? What you want fat pigs, right? Because that's higher yield, right? Good for your business. The problem was that a lot of pigs were sick from the crops that they ate. Their immune system were dysregulated. They actually had social detachment from, the herd. And they also didn't gain a lot of weight. And they found that the reason for that is a specific mold toxin in the grain called vomitoxin. The short version is DON, and it's a non-chemical name, deoxy something.
Yep.
And it's actually the most common toxin that's infesting crops, especially in India, China, and in the US, the worst countries, but also Europe. And this toxin was the reason for the immune dysregulation, for the social withdrawal, and for the loss of the weight gain. And so what they in the study used to treat the corn that they were feeding these pigs was sodium sulfate, which is SOS. And so I asked the boy, I'm like, is this what you meant? And he replied, yes, Mom, this is what I meant. It's, this chemical. And so we started talking about chemistry. We're like, okay, this is sodium sulfate. And we eventually got to the real chemical, which is sodium thiosulfate. And that's just like, that's it, and it goes, I sent him some, I was a lot into genetics back then, genetic charts of detoxification and methylation, all of that. And he's like, it's exactly right there in the glutathione cycle. That's where the answer is with sodium thiosulfate. And we're like, whoa. So of course, meanwhile, I learned that the boy has an IQ, he says, of 500. He can read 800 words a minute. He can, he's connected to God directly. And later I found out with the telepathy tapes, yep, he's going to the hill. He's been there for a long time. He has his friends. But we wanted to explore that chemical because he was like, wow, I've never heard about sodium thiosulfate. So discovery in the 18th century, and medical application started in the 20th century. It was approved, sodium thiosulfate, in the IV form by the FDA in 1939. And I've never heard about it. I grew up in Germany. I went to medical school, residency, 16 years of practice, never heard of sodium thiosulfate. So in 1939, it was approved for cyanide poisoning. And until today, when you go to the ER with cyanide poisoning, you don't get oxygen first, you get sodium thiosulfate. So it has remained over 80 years. We have known it's a very safe, intravenously administered sulfated salt, or sulfur that is salted, no matter how you want to put it. But that's all it is, salt and a special bond. It's a double bond with two sulfur molecules. And so, of course, what did we do? We started to use it for selected patients, first ourselves, and then our patients. And we very quickly saw, oh my God, all of these results, clarity, and the children having more eye contact, less stimming, better behavior. Ultimately, a lot of them.
Percentage-wise, how much? Varied across the board, or
improvement? I would say probably in the 80+% range.
As much as that, really?
It was the crazy, and I was in practice already for 5 years, and I've done so many things, hyperbarics, parasite cleanses, vitamins, minerals, you name it, GC-MAF, everything under the sun. Nothing came even close to the results that we saw in such a quick manner. And then we're like, all right, how does this work? And learned everything, every paper that is available in the internet about sodium thiosulfate. And what we found is that there's 3 mechanisms that are likely the reason for why we see these benefits. And the most important one is that when you have glutathione, right, most of it in the body, 70% is in the liver. Why? Because most toxins that we get exposed to is what we put in our mouth, right? And if you have overgrowth of bacteria in the gut that causes a leak in the gut because bacteria produce LPS, lipopolysaccharide, gram-negative bacteria, it's a known reason to create that or open that door for everything under the sun, from industrial toxins to heavy metals to mold toxins to food proteins like casein and wheat or gluten. And in the liver, it's like your border control, right? Like, hey, nobody passes here because you make it into the blood. Oh my God, the immune system will go nuts if you make it there. So in the liver, we have glutathione. And glutathione binds any chemical, or most toxins. There are other detox mechanisms, alcohol and things like that get metabolized different, but glutathione is a big one. So they grab the toxin, and what actually happens is that the glutathione donates a sulfur ion, which makes the toxin less negatively charged and more soluble in water, so it's ready for excretion, right? But the problem was that the glutathione at that point, having donated its sulfur ion, is not able to bind another toxin because it gave away its sulfur, right? So it can be recycled or repaired. The problem was that the repair process is actually what's defective in chronic disease.
What, in the methylation, in the genetic methylation process? Or
methylation is part of the production of glutathione, but the recycling of glutathione actually requires different genes, and it actually requires an energy called NADPH. And NADPH is something very difficult for the body to produce, but why wouldn't it be there in autism, let's say? Well, the reason is that NADPH is not only involved in recycling glutathione, but more so to reduce free radicals. And so it's like it's rather going to the burning house rather than to prevent the fire in the house next to it, which is kind of logic, right? If you see an accident on the street, do you want to help the injured, or you want to kind of figure out, well, what caused the accident? You want to go to where the action is. So NADPH has an affinity for superoxide, which is free radicals. And so let's say you have a problem with alternative ways to recycle. Sodium thiosulfate is one of them, which we found out later. So we can produce thiosulfate as a backup. The problem is if you have genetic problems with sulfation. Glyphosate is one inhibitor of that, and so that genetics also. But
glyphosate as in the pesticide?
Yeah, glyphosate in the pesticide is an inhibitor of sulfation. So if you have genetic predispositions, you're very prone to not being able to recycle. So if you now have a trigger, such as a vaccine or severe overgrowth of bacteria after the use of, let's say, antibiotics or whatever else, all of the NADPH is sucked into that initial insult. And now, being already predisposed of not being able to have NADPH for the recycling, well, this thiosulfate should be able to kick in from our own sulfur. Well, if you have genetic predispositions, you're screwed.
Wow.
And you're locked into chronic inflammation. And that's why a child getting vaccinated at 18 months has the same autism at the age of 40. But you can interject into that. And so we found that sodium thiosulfate quickly recycles glutathione. And two functions of glutathione is one, bind toxins. The other one is reduce inflammation. And so the moment you reduce inflammation, you free up the NADPH. So it's not that you need it forever. It's just need a kickstart of the system to, detoxify and reduce the toxic burden in the gut with the bacteria. And so we saw it. We developed a lotion out of it because we couldn't give it IV. And if you take it orally, even though it's very safe, I took 8 grams before. There's no toxicity, but it mostly gets degraded by the stomach acid. So we have to find alternative ways, and found that the lotion is, working amazing. So that was one big finding that we found through one 9-year-old nonverbal child. And we give all credit to him. I would have never in a million years found this. I've never even heard about it. But he told us. And later he told us about other mechanisms, which you really, when he tells you the, very small amounts of this information, you're like, it's so profound, because it's like you've never even heard about anything like this. He talked later about the ventricle communication channels, called foramen, are being obstructed by protein aggregates that leak into the brain because of albumin and virus interactions, and how the sodium thiosulfate breaks up those clogs. And like, who could even make this up? The parents certainly weren't. They were very faithful, non-medically parents, and it was quite remarkable to learn from him. His name was Jacob. His name is Jacob, and
that's just. I'm taking a moment to process, really, because you've got two things going on there, haven't you? You've got a miracle, really, of this, and that's what I love about the telepathy tapes that brought me in, was this sense that these people that have been dismissed, these individuals that have been dismissed as not being in there, have sort of knocked on the window of their skull, as it were, and said, "Hello, we're here." And then not only have they done that, which is miraculous, then they're coming out with stuff that then takes you as a doctor down a line of research which starts to present cures. And on both fronts, you're smashing straight up against mainstream thinking that, even faced with the evidence of what's happening there, they can't accept it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, I'm not trying to prove it to those individuals. I want to help this child. What can this family do right now? Because this child at 2:00 in the morning is banging his head against the door. I don't need approval. I want to help this family. And if they're willing to do the work with us, we help them through it. And then you help the next person, and we interview them and we capture it. We have so many interviews with parents that tell their story. Just let them talk, because that's, in my opinion, more powerful than, we need to do a randomized controlled trial to see if this works, and that's just, seeing is believing. And we have certainly the receipts in video and hundreds of testimonials that I've written. We're living it. We're on a battlefield. We're not sitting in a bureau with, the agencies to figure things out. No, we're in the field Monday to Sunday with families. A lot of it, we give a lot of stuff away for free time, but 24/7, we want to figure this out. And I think we have a good system. And, with telepathy tapes is incredible. It wasn't really a new concept for me, because I already met Jacob, but it was certainly interesting to know, oh my God, is it every child, that has these abilities? And so, but even then,
I like to think that we need a paradigm shift on a number of fronts, and what we're discussing here is one of them. The issue about the power of the pharmaceutical companies is a real issue. Even putting your hand up and saying, "Can we at least have a conversation about that?" When you're shut down, when you're ridiculed and belittled for having any questions in and around these areas, that there's a psyop going on, or there's a brainwashing or a propaganda campaign going on, because reasonable people, given the proper rationale, would ask these questions. And I think more of them are. But there seems to be, like with the telepathy tapes, I like to think there's something bigger going on, which is forming part of a bigger picture of who we are as humans, which are these constantly evolving, Jeffrey Krypow is going to be my guest on Friday. I don't know if you know him. He's a professor at Rice University of religion, comparative religion and philosophy. And one of the things he talks about is this thing about consciousness is split. The primary consciousness is split into humans as matter and mind. And we are that split from this kind of super source, let's say, of where precognition, the future, past, quantum physics, all those things kind of relate. Right? And I quite like the theory, but he says, along with Tom Campbell, that we're kind of like in the larval stage, as human beings, we've been given this ability to be able to have these intellectual conversations and language, which are different from animals, and kind of like we have this propensity to sort of grow and drive towards something which represents our own, unlocking of our own potential, and then as a collective. And I think that this potential, this kind of X-Men stuff with the telepathy tapes, is maybe some step in our evolution further down the line that we're seeing signs of. And it's just wonderful that it's coming out of these children, because it takes care of another aspect that we need to catch up on as well, which is, the medical profession and having an honest look at one. What do you think about that?
I think what you said is beautiful. You've wrapped it up pretty nice. And I have that curiosity too, and certainly for the greater good of humanity. However, I do believe it's not the right state to be for these kids. Yes, we can learn about the human potential, that it is possible, but my intuition tells me that this is deliberate, because I know about MK Ultra, started in the 50s, mind control, spying on other nations, all of that. These kids didn't have a choice to be in this state. And despite having these abilities, if I wouldn't be there as the parent, they probably would be dead in the next 24 hours, right?
Yeah, they need total care, don't they?
Reproduction, humanity would die if they stay in this condition. Don't have a military. They can start their own families. They don't have jobs. They're not contributing to society for the GDP and all of that. So it's not the right state to be.
No.
It's beautiful to see that at least it's not brain damage and that there's nothing going on.
Mm.
Yes, that is beautiful. And I saw it in my own son, and I had to see it with my own eyes. I was bawling. I was like, thank God, at least you're in there. Well, it's probably just a motor coordination thing.
Yeah.
A motor disconnect. You're disconnected from your body, but your mind is there. Thank God.
Yeah.
And that really calmed my soul, because of all these years, I'm like, oh my God, am I causing more brain damage? There's definitely disconnections, dysfunctions, toxicity, no doubt, but intellect, no. It's not affected, and I've seen enough evidence now that this is the case, including some of the families that are involved in the telepathy tapes. One of which just wrote us a beautiful testimonial, Trevor's mom.
Trevor, sorry, I've forgotten her name now. I've interviewed her, Laura Hirsch. Yes.
Yeah, she's incredible mom, and they're seeing incredible progress. Also with the seizures and all of that. And
wow.
But at the end of the day, I can't spend too much time and
sure,
is this evolution or not, because it's not the state that they should be in. Because then if you learn, or at least what I believe is the reason for that ability, it makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more, I think, explainable, less mystic, and more rooted in the biology of what is possible from our bacteria, basically. Because if you look at, I'm not sure how familiar you are with psychedelics.
I'm very familiar with psychedelics.
So we have, let's say, LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, right? Or ketamine even. All of these substances induce psychedelic states, right? You lose your sense of time. You feel the connectiveness with the universe. You see things. You hallucinate. And so it's obviously a different existence, right? And you're not functional while you're, let's say, taking a heroic dose of psilocybin or a big dose of LSD. Now, what's interesting is that all of these psychedelics, well, MDMA is not a psychedelic, but it's, I think, a pathogen. And is that they have in its core tryptamine. And tryptamine is an amino acid. And, they all work on the same receptor system in the brain. Some have other receptors, but the main receptor that they all dock onto is 5-H2A,
mm-hmm.
including serotonin.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that 95% of the serotonin that is produced in our body is coming from the microbiome. From the microbiome interaction with the enterochromaffin cells of the GI tract to produce serotonin. Only 5% is produced in the brain. And what's interesting is that the serotonin is produced by what we call gram-negative bacteria.
Explain that to me. What is that?
And so we have, gram-negative and gram-positive is just how, the bacteria changes colors to identify them in a petri dish.
Okay.
So there's gram-positive that stain blue, and the gram-negative stain purple. It's a gram stain, we call. And the reason is that the pigment gets absorbed because one of them has a outer wall, the other one doesn't. And the gram-negatives have this outer wall, so they have an envelope. And what's interesting is that these gram-negatives, they're part of us, right? Klebsiella, Prevotella, Bacteroides, in fact, is one of the most abundant bacteria, gram-negative, in our large intestine. The problem is that all of these bacteria in their membrane, these gram-negative bacteria in their membrane, have a toxin that's called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And that's just a very reactive toxin. So it's the reason that it punches a hole in the gut to create leaky gut.
Leaky gut.
Known to do that. Many studies have shown that. And then it goes further, and once it makes it into the blood, it actually suppresses the immune system.
Right.
It causes problems with class switching, antibody production, suppressing natural killer cells. And that's actually the reason why you barely see that our children with autism get sick. And they're like, man, it's so healthy. When in fact, it's just the immune system not responding to viruses and, other threats like that. And then LPS causes brain inflammation. So it's actually used in studies. If you have a rat and you want to study seizures and you want the rat to have a seizure, you know exactly how much LPS to inject. And so that's one aspect of these gram-negative bacteria. And, my colleague that I work with, Alex Saharikis, who is a genius because he has developed a tool, software, to interpret a stool test and tell you exactly which bacteria are high and which ones are low, which is an incredible program. We can talk about that.
Yeah.
But over the years, last 5 years, 2,000 plus samples later that he has analyzed, has found that one of the major components of the microbiome problem in these children or also non-autistic individuals with chronic disease have severe overgrowths of these gram-negative bacteria. Let's say your Prevotella, right? That's what we found pretty often. Prevotella copri, able to produce LPS, tryptamine, and serotonin. And when it should be about 1% of the entire microbiome, we find it at 50, 60, 70% overgrown. And you don't have to be a genius to figure out that's not normal. That if it should be 1%, but it's 60% and it's able to produce these toxins and neurotransmitters like serotonin, that's a huge problem. And I've done neurotransmitter testing in a lot of individuals, mostly in autism, for about 4 years. I don't do it anymore. And I found almost every child with autism had elevations of tryptamine and serotonin in the urine. And I could never figure out, why is that? Never made that connection that it's because of the severe overgrowth of those bacteria in the gut that can produce it. And so our SSRIs, these serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are they being prescribed to people who've got this problem so that they can lower their serotonin levels based on? In fact, I'll tell you about that, why that is actually a big problem and why SSRIs are not helpful in autism. Just really quick. So I found the tryptamine and serotonin in the urine.
Right.
And now we have the evidence through my colleague Alex that there's massive overgrowth of bacteria that produce it. So what evidence do we have that this is, can cause problems? Well, first of all, we know serotonin elevations. If you take massive doses of 5-HTP, it's a supplement, you take it. Let's overdose. Let's see what happens. How would you feel? You would feel severe nausea, and then the anxiety kicks in. If you go higher, you can have a panic attack. If you go higher, you can have hallucinations and so on, eventually lead to psychosis and autism. So we know that serotonin was high and tryptamines are high. Well, is there actually any evidence that our microbiome can produce psychedelic substances? And so we know you've probably heard of DMT.
I was going to say DMT gets produced. That they attribute it to the white light and these experiences at death and stuff.
I talked to the guy who made that first proposal that it's produced in the pineal gland. He worked at the University of Michigan before he went to California, and we talked. And even there, it's not concrete.
No.
That it does. I suspect, of course, it does, because dreaming is a hallucination, and DMT is making that happen. But listen to this. There is also, first of all, what is DMT?
It's one molecule different from psilocybin. It's just like there's one branch, I think, isn't it?
Well, I told you earlier that tryptamines were very high and serotonin was very high.
Yeah.
But the precursor to tryptamine is actually tryptophan, right?
Yeah.
Which comes from turkey, from a lot of different food groups.
Bacon.
Chicken.
Bacon's got tryptophan. Right. Yeah.
And so if we have bacteria that are able to use tryptophan to produce tryptamines, well, what do you need to get from tryptamine to DMT? All you need is an enzyme called INMT, which is present in the gut, and you need 2 methyl groups, because all tryptamine, to become tryptamine, is 2 methyl groups, di-2-methyl tryptamine. Yeah. And you have DMT. Do we have evidence of that? Unfortunately not. It's just nobody has tested it yet. But if you methylate serotonin, tryptamine becomes serotonin. If you methylate serotonin, what do you get then? You get something called bufotenin. And you've probably heard about that.
That comes from the frogs.
From the toads, right?
Toads, yeah.
If you torture a toad, he releases bufotenin. People take it, they burn it in them, or they smoke it.
Yeah.
And they have a little bit of a different experience than DMT. It's not as potent. However, it's like ego death and other things very potent with bufotenin. But there was a 2010 study in Italy, I think it was in Parma, that measured urinary and stool concentrations of bufotenin. And guess what? All children with autism and schizophrenia had it. And only 1 out of many in the control group had it elevated. And so there we go. It's just a logical consequence that if I have evidence, and there is literature evidence that there's higher serotonin levels and tryptamine levels in autism, of course, why wouldn't there be higher levels of DMT or bufotenin in autism? And that's what I believe is the reason, because here's the thing. When you do ayahuasca, right, what do you have? You have 2 plants. One is DMT. The other one is an inhibitor. That breaks down, MAO inhibitor. Now, I've studied genetics for 4 years, very intensive counseling with MTHFR and all of the methylation genes, but also the neurotransmitter genes, COMT, and especially MAO, monoamine oxidase. That's breaking down serotonin, also dopamine. But the interesting thing about that is that, usually we have 1 gene from each parent, right? 2, just in case one doesn't work, well, we have a backup. But MAO is an interesting one because it only is on the X chromosome. So we only get it from mom. So boys only have 1 MAO. So it better not be effed up, right? If it is, it's severely reduced in function, about 70%. If you have a SNP in your MAO. We call it hemizygous, not heterozygous or homozygous, but hemizygous.
Wow.
So if you now have severe overgrowth of bacteria, like my colleague Alex has found, you have massive amounts of tryptamine, you're genetically susceptible, not being able to break it down, well, guess what? You take a big dose of LSD and have this talk with me, see how difficult that is. And that's what I believe is part of the reason for some of these abilities. It's just that, a lot of these kids that communicate with us, they say they completely feel disconnected from their body. Body's not responding. That's why a lot of kids want to ground themselves. They want pressure, they flap their hands because they're like taking off. I don't know how it feels, but I can imagine.
And so what you're saying to me is this, it seems, let me summarize. These individuals are tripping based on what's going on in their stomach with bacteria. And it's affecting the brain chemistry and effectively releasing what are akin to kinds of like psychedelics, keeping them in their right brain to have a right brain experience whilst they're in the world, which requires some part of their left brain to process language and finer motor skills and so on and so forth. Would that be about right?
Yes. There's more involved to it. There are many other toxicities, heavy metals, there's ammonia, there are oxalates, there's, believe it or not, cyanide involved.
So let's go through that. Let's go through the toxins. But to go back, can I just go back to the LPS? How does that get there? How does that get to be increased by 60% in the gut? What's causing that?
So, good question. So, again, we have 100 trillion bacteria in us, right? We have more genetic information in our bacteria than human information. So it's just part of evolution. The Earth's flora is shaping us, right? They're good. They're supposed to be there. Now, out of these 100 trillion, there are thousands of different families. And the families have different types of, members. Clostridium difficile, Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium perfringens, Lactobacillus, many different subspecies. And, when we're born, a baby going through the birth canal mostly picks up bifidobacteria. So that's like it's actually a gram-positive bacteria. It's a very beneficial bacteria. So when a baby's born, actually 80% after birth of their microbiome, because they're born sterile, right? They weren't exposed to bacteria. 80% is bifidobacteria. And as we introduce breast milk and the environment and, just the environment exposure, including then the introduction of solids, that 80% kind of goes down in a young child to about 20%, 15%, and adult is like 10, 15%, right? Because then other bacteria come and get introduced. But, what's interesting is that bifidobacteria is the bacteria that actually sets the pH of our gut. And it has to be a specific pH, right, for all of the other bacteria to exist. And usually keeping it fairly acidic. And so the problem is now when you have things like glyphosate everywhere, in prenatal vitamins, in breast milk it was found, in formula, in blah, blah, everything, right? Glyphosate is able to destroy bifidobacteria and is able to destroy lactobacillus. And so then we have the child with an ear infection and the pediatrician throws antibiotics left and right. So many families that I see, I always ask them before the age of 2, how many rounds of antibiotics? Oh, 4, 5, immediately. Every little thing, every little fever, antibiotics. So we're destroying the microbiome very early on, not to even speak about vaccines and the data that we have in regards to studies that show, how vaccines affect the microbiome negatively. And then, of course, many other foods, but
formula milk,
exactly, mostly soy-based, or, cows, they feed them alfalfa, which is a GMO, and they spray with glyphosate. And milk is actually one of the largest carriers of glyphosate that you can get in the food industry. And so, when we're looking now at Alex's data, we've written a paper, it's like 36 pages of what we found, in regards to improvements and all of that. But when Alex does his test and they come back, many, many times we see that both lactobacillus and bifido, when it should be at least 5 to 15%, is at 0.01% in these children, like literally non-detectable. So it's absent. So when that's absent, the pH is not regulated. And that's similar to your temperature in your fridge. If it's not cool enough, well, what happens? Bacteria grow, right? And so when you don't have bifido, these gram-negative bacteria start growing. And the gram-negatives are there for a reason, but if they're now 100 times increased in volume, and you start feeding them with, carbs and sugars and all of that, they release their toxins. And it's just that the gram-negative have in their structure, remember, they have this LPS toxins. It's just part of every gram-negative bacteria.
Got you.
And so if you now, start to mess with them, you start to reduce them, well, guess what? They release their LPS. Or if you go on a diet, for example, right, and you restrict carbs, initially you feel like crap because they don't get the food, they release their LPS. They tell you, stop, eat some sugar.
And it's okay, and that's what, so people who go on keto and they talk about keto flu, that's where you get the kind of inflammation, the achy joints.
Yes. And so that is exactly what happens. And then there's other toxins, like we discussed, chemicals, tryptamines, serotonin, there's ammonia, there's oxalates, there's histamine. So all of these we have learned over the years can create very specific symptoms, like serotonin, OCD, hyperactivity, anxiety, psychosis, nausea. You get cold hands, cold feet, rapid heartbeat, rapid breathing. That's serotonin, 100%. Then you have ammonia, head banging causes brain swelling. You have this giddy laughter. You have night wakenings. You have other things that these bacteria release, like oxalates. Those are tiny little crystals that get released.
They're like in spinach and green, like a lot of vegetables. If you have too much, yeah.
But the amount that you get in those vegetables compared to what your body's producing is really negligible. So we are not like, oh, you got to get in a low oxalate diet. We did not find that very helpful.
Really? Okay.
But hey, for whatever works for you, because there are good things in spinach too. But
yeah,
the oxalates, because they're tiny crystals, that combined with calcium, they cause kidney stones. And I'm not saying autistic kids have kidney stone problems, but they certainly grab their privates often when they do. Or they have, problems with bedwetting at night. Or they have problems with, poking their eyes or squinting or looking in the air because the crystals, these microcrystals, reflect light in the retina, and that you see, colors and things like that.
Wow, okay.
And so we made all of these correlations with these different toxins that the microbiome is producing. And, Alex is probably, I would say, the world's most knowledgeable person in regards to having learned not just what is high and what is low, but how to correlate it with a particular patient's symptoms.
Wow.
And then, starting learning over the years of how to bring balance back and seeing the improvements that occur with it is magic, really. But yeah, in general, we want to approach this usually very carefully. We want to make sure that get a good history of the patient, and then before you just dive into trying to correct the microbiome, we want to support the systems, support the liver, make sure they poop, calm the immune system, strengthen their liver and detox capacity before we start trying to hit the bee's nest. Because if you come unprepared, you're going to get your butt stung,
Wow. And this is it, isn't it? What you've just said here, it really does amplify how just changing your diet can have so much of an effect on you. I mean, diet's been talked about for years, but if you don't get it right, this is why a lot of things fail, I reckon, because, you go, like, I've tried the keto diet a bunch of times, right? And I've had those symptoms and how you work through them and how, like looking at, if you have blood tests done, what are your own methylation genes, because you might have a deficient gene, which is causing a methylation problem and so on and so forth. And so if you don't get that right, then it doesn't matter what you're putting in or what you're taking out, you're not doing the right thing. Yeah. So having those tests and working it on an individual basis rather than a one size fits all is what you're all about.
Absolutely. And diet is very important, but what we have learned is that, unfortunately, what we believe it's not enough. If you have such severe deficiencies of good bacteria and overgrowth of others, it's so difficult, especially in a child that's very restrictive in what they eat. One of the symptoms of high serotonin is nausea. So they just don't want to eat anything, texture, weirdness. And so, good luck introducing your broccoli and all of this good food. It's just not going to be possible. You're happy if they eat their crackers. But a lot of that starts to come back, and we do believe that they do require some help with not medications, but the herbs of Mother Earth. Alex has this library of hundreds and hundreds of different herbs and prebiotics and fibers and probiotics. What do they do? When do you need them? For which patient? So every patient that he analyzes, he customizes the approach over the next 6 weeks with a schedule, all for free. It provides all of these suggestions for free. You can email him the sample, $130. For that gut test, it goes to California through a sequencer, gives you a raw data. Send that data to Alex. He analyzes that data and sends you a free report.
Really?
And
that's an incredible service, isn't it? To give to somebody.
Yeah, and his advantage was that he had the privilege to work with these families and collect data. After every 6 weeks, after what the suggestions that he made with these herbs that are evidence-based, he not only retested to see what effect did this have in the 6 weeks, but also surveys. How did your child improve? Did he sleep better? Did he have more rashes? Did he have detox symptoms? When did you start to see improvement? All of these questions, over and over and over, and you do that thousands of times, you get a good idea of where the signals are, what works, what doesn't. And that comes through being on a battlefield, not in a, government agency sitting there or looking at some weird study. We're out in the battlefield, and we interact with families daily. That's our lives, and this is really an amazing system.
Wow. Wow. I'm so impressed. I mean, and also you're listening to what the other sort of, let's say, legacy mainstream wouldn't listen to, which is the parents who know best. If they're saying, look, there's an improvement, I've got this is happening, you've got to take that seriously, whereas it wouldn't be taken seriously, would it? It would be.
It's absolutely, and that's how I learned. I mean, my intake is 53 pages. Before I even meet with a patient, I have them answer 53 pages of, I know it's maybe kind of a turnoff, but I don't want to waste time I want to educate and discuss concepts rather than, hey, is your child sleeping through the night? You can answer all of that before we meet. Yeah. I really want the parent to understand what we're doing, to be on board, because then they can advocate maybe and tell somebody else. We need thousands of more practitioners to help the millions and millions that are wounded. But I mean, what I learned is that listening is everything. Listening, because there's so many clues that are otherwise missed. We can never assume. That's not being a good detective. You always have to gather all of the evidence and then customize it for that individual. And I mean, parents appreciate it. Not everybody can go through a protocol like this. There's life, right? And
of course.
But we work with everyone to their ability. And we're always there for answering questions and being there for them along the way, along the path if they have questions. And that's what we do.
Okay, we're just coming up on just over an hour now, so I want to round this off. I could talk to you for hours on this because it's so fascinating, but I just want to finish by addressing this issue. You're doing what you do. You're in the chemical, what's going on with the chemistry of the body, and that's so important because we do have a body, and these things can't be dismissed. And I'm glad to hear that our awareness of diet and nutrition and what we should be doing. It sounds like everybody should be on these kinds of protocols, really, not just the autistic, because I think processed food and the fact that governments have allowed corporations to poison us with foods that are ultra processed, that have got drugs in them that make you eat more, that trick the body, that trick the brain, high fructose corn syrups and all the rest of it, that we know have caused not just physical problems, diabetes and so on, but also the psychological problems, I think, that what you're discussing. So it sounds to me like everybody needs to have this kind of program. It would be a fantastic thing if that could happen, because I think it would restore so much of people's well-being that would enable them to go on a path to then deal with this other aspect of this, which is why I bring it up as a kind of evolutionary coincidence, because you're quite right. These individuals are non-functioning. They need care and support. But they're showing us something about what Ian McGilchrist says is what happens to us when we have a psychedelic, what happens to us when we're in our right brain. And our right brain, which is what we've ignored in the last 100 and odd years, really, and become very left brain, which has become, as in the words of Ian McGilchrist, the master instead of the emissary, and doesn't show us that the right brain is connected or potentially connected to so much more, and it is the wiser of the two hemispheres in terms of seeing the bigger picture. Left brain focuses in on the details, right brain sees the bigger picture, and there's an oscillation in a healthy individual between the two. And I don't think we can get there to know something about the bigger questions of our existence with regards to these big existential questions without that physical, chemical, biological health and well-being that you're doing. Would you agree?
Yeah. To add to that, what you said in regards to the disconnect of the hemispheres is something else that we found very interesting, is that when we initially talked about the sodium thiosulfate being a recycling booster for oxidized glutathione. One of the other mechanisms, obviously, was the question that we had to answer was, is there cyanide involved in autism? Because that's what it's been approved for, right, since 1939. So we're like, there's no way, right? And so we're like, how can we measure it in autism? It's never been done. Entire literature that you can find on cyanide is on acute toxicity, poisoning or accidental. Most common reason, 50,000 cases in the US every year is because of house fires. You burn your couch, rich in carbon and nitrogen, produces cyanide. So burn victims, firefighters, 50,000 a year get treated with sodium thiosulfate in the ERs. But nothing about chronic cyanide, right? And so we're like, all right, well, it works so well, we have to explore it. And so if you come in the ER with acute cyanide toxicity, you try to kill yourself, nobody's running a cyanide level in your blood because you need to freeze that blood, put it through a sequencer. It's very difficult to measure. So we go by lactate, right? Cyanide is a mitochondrial inhibitor. You die of lactic acidosis.
Okay.
So they measure lactic acid level. And so we had no way to check it on the kids. However, we found these water testing strips. You dip it in water, and it measures per parts per million how many particles of cyanide are in that water. It's
like a urine test.
It was a water test, right? Not meant for humans. But we're like, well, if it's so sophistically per parts per million, and it had like different, the more cyanide was in the water, the deeper the blue was. And you had these charts, that came with it, $10 test. So we're like, all right, if it measures it in water, why wouldn't it measure the cyanide levels in urine or in saliva? Test doesn't know.
Yeah, saliva.
And so we did it. Urine, all negative. And then we checked in about 20 autistic patients. Boom, the saliva, everyone positive. Deep blue. Check the mothers, check the neurotypical siblings, light blue. Autism, dark blue. And I have a chart that, I just posted on social media, all of these cases. Now, then we were like, there's no doubt in our mind, oh my God, it's the cyanide. It blocks motor neurons. There are different types of neurons in the brain requiring different amounts of energy to fire. Motor neurons are one of the highest energy requirements, highest mitochondrial density. So you would think, oh, those are the first structures in the brain that wouldn't function. It's like a car, but you can't start it because there's no gas, right? And so that started to make sense because there's so many studies that show that autism is a mitochondrial problem, not genetic, some toxin. And that would be a good explanation of what it could be. So we were like, all right, it's cyanide in the body. They can't get rid of it. How does the body get rid of cyanide? It binds to iron, and then the sodium thiosulfate that we produce is making it into thiocyanate. We can pee it out. Again, the kids don't have thiosulfate.
So that's coming. Oh, okay, right, that makes sense.
But then we had to answer the question, where the heck is it coming from? Where's the cyanide coming from? And first we're like, oh, it's a diet. But then we had too many parents over the years doing these perfect diets, and it didn't make a dent in the child, or at least very minimal. So we're like, it's not diet. Even though we know it's in cassava, lima beans, dark chocolate, even some cruciferous vegetables, the FDA and EPA don't even deny the fact that there's small amounts of cyanides in these foods.
In dark chocolate? What sort of concentration levels, just as an aside? Is it high?
Well, it's tiny, right? And they're like, it's minimal, because our body has mechanisms to get rid of these tiny amounts. So that was interesting enough to see, oh, okay, so we have mechanisms to get rid of cyanide. Oh, it's thiosulfate. Okay. And this enzyme called rhodinase, which is more, all of our tissues, brain, liver, and all of that, which is inhibited by arsenic and probably glyphosate. But the point is that the cyanide did probably not come from the diet. So where is it coming from? So listen to this. There was a European study that showed that in corn and wheat, about 60% of European corn and wheat, and that was actually in a collaboration with the University of Arizona, is contaminated with this mold type called Fusarium. And Fusarium is just one of the most common mold types worldwide contaminating crops, right? In the US, we have about 70% of cropping in the US is sprayed with glyphosate, just to give you an example. So let's say corn and wheat are infested with Fusarium. or you have a grape. Well, Fusarium loves to grow in grapes. That's why you wash your vegetables and a lot of these things. There are many other food types, soy and barley and other things like that. But let's focus on corn and wheat. So let's say you have a crop growing that contains Fusarium, and there are guidelines in every country of when you harvest your crops, that there's guidelines. You got to test your crops to see how many particles per million of particular mold toxins are in there. And that's why that one study that I found with the boys coming out, because, all right, if you do your crops and you have just above, what's allowed, what are you going to do? You're going to go bankrupt as a farmer? No, there are ways to treat the corn, such as the SOS or bleaching or ozone, which is too expensive. Nobody does it. So a lot of bleaching is going on, right? You strip the outer layers off, get rid of all of these mold toxins, which is getting rid of a lot of minerals, right? That's why bleaching is bad. That's why white bread is bad. But the thing is this, that the mold that grows on these crops, when Fusarium comes in contact with glycine, it produces cyanide. And that's a known phenomenon. There's other mold types that can do that.
So it's being produced in the mouth by mixing them together? Is that what you're saying? Sorry?
I have a suspicion.
Okay.
Where is the glycine coming from?
Yeah.
And that's glyphosate. Because glyphosate's chemical formula is N-phosphorylglycine. And so when you spray glyphosate on these crops, which we do since the 90s, right? And worldwide, a lot of glyphosate is being used. The mold that's already on there is producing cyanide and leaves cyanide on our crops.
Wow.
Even if we get rid of the mold, doesn't mean you get rid of the cyanide, because there's no FDA regulations to routinely check crops for cyanide. And so that's where we believe is one of the sources that the pesticides that we spray on our food is actually producing cyanide, because the mold toxins that we know are growing on there. It's just a logical consequence. It's just nobody has tested our food yet. But if we know that there's mold growing in the majority of our crops, we know we're spraying them we know that when glyphosate breaks down, it releases glycine, which is just a logical consequence that mold is making cyanide.
Wow.
And so nobody has tested. I just called for action to the HHS here and Kennedy. But who knows? I don't have a big enough voice, but that's what we want. There's also bacteria that can produce this, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's usually a lung, bacteria, but has also been found in the gut. So it's just a very under-researched area. There are mouth bacteria that can produce hydrogen cyanide, and it's crazy, because when we talked with Brian Hooker about this, from Children's Health Defense, he almost fell off his chair when we came up with this. And he's like calling us the next day, and he's like, guys, you wouldn't believe it. They use cyanide in the development of vaccines. Right there, we found on the package insert of hepatitis B, MMR, and Prevnar, that they use cyanide in the development of these vaccines. Why the heck would they do that? Well, in the case of MMR, they use cyanide to extract the virus once, it grew in the human aborted fetal cells. They use cyanide to extract the viruses. And so who knows? Maybe there's cyanide in the vaccines, some contaminants. We don't know that, never been tested. So why aren't we doing that? But I think there's a huge problem with cyanide. Many people, eat foods they don't feel good. Many people get rapid heartbeats, anxiety, cold hands, cold fingers, headaches, migraines. It's all could be low doses of cyanide causing your mitochondria to not work, produce lactic acid.
I mean, the Zoe people talk about the fact that they're now spraying glyphosate on crops to dry them out quicker at the end of the harvest. So it's getting a massive dose, which our gut then gets as a massive dose of this, which is, as they say, obviously going to affect our microbiome. But
100%, yeah.
They're not talking about the fact that it could be producing bloody cyanide. This
Yeah, and like you said, the glyphosate itself is toxic to the microbiome, and so it's almost like you induce some of this into the body until the body produces its own cyanide. It's kind of like this perfect poison, because initially you just grow it, people eat it, keep it going, but it's
because one thing you do feel when you do the ketogenic diet and you stop bread is you feel a lot better.
Yeah.
Because
one of my weaknesses.
Me too. I mean, I really miss my toast. I love toast and jam and stuff like that. And it's actually, once you give it up, you go, oh God, I really miss it. You don't realize quite how you were addicted to bread.
You don't feel so bloated. Yeah,
exactly.
You feel less toxic. Your brain works better. I agree.
Isn't it funny? Christian, thanks so much for this. You've given us all a chemistry lesson, and it's been mind blowing. This connection, between what's going on in the stomach and between what's going on in the mind. There've always been this. 25 years ago, I remember one of our famous news casters over here. His name's Jeremy Paxman, BBC Two Newsnight. The sort of upper class, sort of more higher class British people who watch BBC Two Newsnight was the educated person's news. And he interviewed somebody who talked to him about diet. Probably 30 years ago, I'm going back now. And he actually said to her, it doesn't matter what we eat, does it? And she was trying to say, I think it's causing all these problems. And it was so controversial. And it still is today in so many areas. Wow.
It obviously is not. We are what we eat. And it's just insanely toxic. The toxic world that we live in. And we're just starting to see the consequences of that. I think all these chemicals and hormone blockers, all of the other things that we see, the rise in this gender dysphoria, not dysphoria, gender identity crisis, I haven't seen that. And it's a lot of relations in regards to that being hormone blockers and it's natural. Well, I'm going to make a lot of enemies, but God bless everyone. But could it be because of toxicity? Could the autism epidemic because of other agendas, especially with the abilities that some of these kids have? We don't know.
Makes lots of sense to ask the question, and it seems fairly obvious even to the layperson that we're just not wired for these things. It's just not natural. It's an unnatural world. When any business, one of the things that is this, when you scale up, the quality goes down, and they've scaled up, food production, and the pharmaceutical companies bought the food companies and said, what magic dust can we put in these Doritos to make sure that they eat the whole pack and buy another pack straight away.
So anybody's interested, autismisbiomedical.com, researchelements.com is our supplements that we have, but we also have a Rumble channel I will give you for a lot more detailed, in-depth chemistry and webinars and interviews with parents and so forth. So I'll give you all of that. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry. Fantastic. Okay. Well, we'll put those links in the description below. Christian, thanks so much for joining me. This has been such an education. I'm sure my viewers are going to get quite a lot from this. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Gary, you're amazing. Thank you so much. It was a privilege. Hopefully we can have future discussions too.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
God bless. Take
Cheers. Care. God bless to you.